been sitting in my candidate daily puzzle archives for quite a bit of time. Jolteon29A, big shout out, came up with this awesome idea, but we couldn't quite find a position that seemed to be daily puzzle friendly, and enter Seth WMD. Seth WMD came up with a nice little twist here, massaged the position in order to make Jolteon29A's amazing idea come into daily puzzle reality. So big shout out to Jolteon29A and Seth WMD. Really appreciate your enthusiasm and daily puzzle contributions. And here with white to move, there's a lot going on. If I'm looking at just things that are threatened, I see our knight is hanging, I'm seeing our queen is under fire, a lot of things, right? Knight is attacking a rook, not so happy about that. On the other hand, we have our own potential. We have a rook on its original square, enjoying the absence of a pawn, meaning it's not staring at its own pawn, but rather staring at this pawn here on a7, the key shield to the enemy king. And this is not a pleasant staring contest for the pawn, nor the king behind it, because this pawn is pinned, meaning if it had to capture something, like something capturing the knight here, wouldn't be possible because it's pinned down to the king. Can't expose your king to an attack here. So one big obstacle I think we have to deal with immediately is when we see that, we're going to immediately start thinking about moves, meaning knight check, bishop takes, you name it, rook sacrifice. These are all exciting ideas, but it's so important that before you start calculating, you should pretend it's the puzzle's move. In other words, if I make a random move, like rook a2, what would the puzzle play? Okay, our queen is hanging, our knight is hanging, get that, so a lot of moves that look pretty unpleasant. But if you think about the puzzle's most forcing idea, the bishop is looking at the g2 pawn. Hey, we have our own pin pawn, as it turns out, pinned to our king, so black can play rook takes pawn, unable to capture the rook because of the pin, and whether we block with the bishop or the queen, doesn't matter. It's going to lead to a really quick checkmate. So if the queen captures, now black captures our queen, delivers mate. And if we try to refuse the rook and move to g1, well, look at this beautiful harmony between the bishop and the rook there. That is also a mate. So always really useful to think about what your opponent would play if they were on the move. Now, on the other hand, I know I have the rook still here on a2, and the puzzle it's on a1, but I also want to point out, once we gain, a sense of danger here, right? Like rook takes pawn is a problem. I also want to think about what exactly is keeping black's position together here, because white is on the move. And notice our knight is endangered, but it's looking at a critical square, b8, right next to the king, and the other knight is looking at c7. So these knights are ready to go. They're ready to hop into the action. They're on the scene. There could be some attacking potential here. So I move the rook to a2, right? Let's pretend black makes a random move, like the bishop on a1, obviously not a sensible move. But the reason I'm pointing that out is imagine the bishop being here. Our queen has x-ray potential, right? With the bishop blocking that diagonal. So if this bishop ever disappears, now there's a number of problems for black. Number one, knight b6 is a forced mate, mate in one. Unable to capture because of the rook pinning the pawn, and the king is unable to escape because of the queen here. Speaking of the queen, if you want to showboat a little bit, you can also sacrifice your queen on b8 with the idea that now, again, with no bishop on e5, the only thing guarding this critical square is the rook, and the rook is forced to capture the queen here, thanks to our knight, right? The king couldn't capture, and now there's a really nice smothered mate. So I'm kind of just sketching out some dreams here for us to keep in mind. But going back to reality, the bishop is on e5, and our rook is on a1. So where do we go from here? Well, the very first thing I want to look at is kind of the most direct path. If I play knight takes knight, there's only one move to calculate, king b8, right? Pawn can't take because of the pin, king is forced here, and now we need to figure out how do we continue. Now, one really cool consequence of removing the knight is don't forget about this bishop kind of chilling out on g1. It has a universal influence all the way across the diagonal, pointing at a7. And here, the only thing in our way is our own knight. So one move to think about is knight to d7. We sacrifice our knight in order to clear open that bishop's diagonal. So if the sacrifice is refused, well then that's mate in one. Very nice harmonious mate between the rook, knight, and bishop. But on the other hand, after the move knight d7, bishop takes knight is the key move. And after bishop takes pawn here, things are looking pretty good. The king is unable to escape thanks to our knight. It's forced to enter that really awkward staring contest between the king and the rook here. And sure, now we can play a move like bishop d4, discovering the rook's attack there against the king. But after the king slides back to b8, it turns out we really can't make any progress here. And we just simply have to be willing to share the point here, repeating moves. There's no way to make any progress. For example, if we take the bishop, now the queen enters the action and we're out of ideas. We're down material, the queen is keeping the king safe, and notice we can't even swing over here. Tons of good moves, there's a rook sacrifice, and simple enough is just take our queen. And again, just not enough firepower here. So a lot of potential. Going all the way back, we looked at the most forcing line first, the line in which you make a move, your opponent has one reply. That's the easiest line to calculate, at least initially. Well, I think we should still focus on b6 at least for one more move, because there is another capture worth mentioning. Bishop takes knight, and if we have one more move, we can take the pawn, and that would be mate. Compliments again of the knight, preventing the king from escaping. The problem here, at the very beginning of the puzzle, it's so useful to say what would happen if the puzzle were on the move, or in your own games, what would happen if it were my opponent's move? What would they play? By doing that, that really increases your sense of danger. Here, black can play rook takes pawn, and the interested viewer can work out all the complications, but the main point, pawn is pinned, unable to capture, rook slides, king slides over, I should say, and now the rook slides down to h1, smokes out the king. Let's try that one more time. Smokes out the king, and although we're dreaming of mate, unfortunately, there's a rook takes rook, checking the king, attacking our rook, and everything's falling apart. So another good reminder, we have a lot of potential. We're wanting to crash that queenside party, but we also have to keep in mind there's storm clouds looming on the king's side as well. So we definitely feel a sense of urgency here. A capture that isn't attacking the king, not good enough. So where do we go from here? Well, the rook lining up with the king is very important, and it's nice to know we do also have a second rook. So maybe we can move over to a1 at some moment. And remember, I kind of forecasted a point that if somehow the bishop disappeared and was no longer guarding this diagonal, we could have some attacking potential. In other words, imagine I play a random move, the bishop captures the rook, all of a sudden the diagonal is open, and we have this really nice smothered mate in the air. Okay, so that's a good dream to keep in mind. The bishop is basically glued to the h2 to b8 diagonal, so moving the rook back, we're not going to play a random move. Remember, rook h3 is a big problem here, so the only other forcing line, other than kind of like a pointless check here, sacrificing our knight without a clear purpose, is the puzzle solution. What remains? Blast open the A file with rook takes pawn. And this is where we need to be careful, because when the king captures, now that the A file is wide open, it's all too easy to slide in the other rook here. With the point that after bishop takes rook, here we might get really excited because we can capture the knight with check, and if the king crouches in the corner, we have knight c7, nearly mate, if not for the rook here. How do we remove the guard? Queen b8. Rook is forced to capture the queen, and now once again we deliver a beautiful mate. Going back, that feels awesome, right? So just to kind of repeat the sensation here, we sacrifice our rook. The A file is wide open. It's so tempting to then play rook a1 and sort of walk your way through euphoria here, where it's like, okay, the bishop takes the rook, I take the knight, the king goes here, I have mate. But what happens if the puzzle doesn't want to be solved? What if the puzzle doesn't want to read your script? Here, the puzzle can play the move king a6. And although the king is certainly on the run, notice the rook is guarding the 5th rank, we have a bishop here that's really annoying, and we're just not able to find a clear follow-up. Sure, we can throw in a check, and in this position, the rook is able to capture the knight, and although we can deliver yet another check, now the defense falls apart. Look at that, the bishop no longer protected, king takes the bishop, and this is a failed attack. Okay, so going back, when we find the first idea on the puzzle solution, rook takes pawn, it's so tempting to think about the only real direct avenue of attack here being the A file. But on the other hand, a far less obvious point, but an important one, is the king isn't just aligned on the A file with our rook. That is important, but also notice from a7, the king is aligned with its own knight, and don't forget about the sleeping bishop. Don't forget about that long distance connection. Here, we can play the move bishop takes knight. a critical difference, right? Before we attacked with the rook first, then we captured with the bishop. Here, we flipped the script. Always important, right? When you have two ways to attack. We could attack with the rook, we could attack with the bishop. You have two move orders. Always be willing to flip the move order and consider the other path. Here, we lead with our bishop first. Now, the big problem with leading with the rook earlier before moving the bishop is king a6 was a big problem. So we have to try to solve that here as well. And this is a good puzzle within itself to just kind of pause and make sure we find the best path. White to move, win, or go home. There's two knight checks to attack the king. Now, one knight has a really, really important role guarding the bishop there. So we actually need to move the other knight that isn't really doing that much to c5. We attack the king. Bishop is still protected by the other knight. Only legal move, king b5. And now we have a harmonious mate with queen a4. Knight guards the queen, the bishop guards the knight guards the knight, and the knight guards the bishop. And this is mate. So really cool idea. And going back, things are looking pretty promising. We sacrificed our rook. The king was forced to accept. We dealt with a little bit of a-file drama. Didn't quite work out, but that can often help us. Where did we hit the wall? We hit the wall when the king was able to move to a6, and we didn't have a clear way to make any progress. By flipping the order of moves, meaning before sacrificing our rook and then capturing the knight, we flipped the script and we led with the bishop first. Now if king a6, we have that awesome mate in 2 in the air. And as the puzzle continues, the crowd-pleasing king a8, now everything is starting to come together. The bishop is trying to hold everything together, supported by the rook and the queen. It's protecting that a1 square, which is important. And notice our queen has some incredible X-ray potential. If the queen could somehow overcome this obstacle, then queen b8 would be a big, big problem. And how do we make that all work? Well, the bishop can't both guard the a1 square and block this diagonal simultaneously. How do we overwhelm the bishop? Rook a1. Absolutely beautiful move. If the bishop blocks, well, then we'll happily take the bishop with mate. And the only other move is bishop takes rook. And now we take advantage of the space left behind. Queen b8, an absolutely beautiful move, the kind of move you always dream about playing in your own games. And here, there's nothing black can do. The rook is forced to capture the queen, and now the knight happily takes advantage of the space the rook left behind, delivering a mate from above. And notice the bishop playing that critical role, preventing the king from escaping. So a really stunning checkmate. A really stunning collaboration between Jolteon29A and Seth WMD. Really appreciate the community working together to come up with such an awesome daily puzzle. Going all the way back, let's see that one more time. Rook takes pawn. We knew we had to be forcing. Otherwise, we become the puzzle rather than the puzzle solvers. King is forced to capture the rook. And now we came up with the key difference. Rook check or bishop takes knight first. We figured out we need to take with the bishop first. That way there's no king a6 issue because, the knight does its thing, attacks the king, and we have mate to follow. And when the king crouches in the corner, we're dreaming of that X-ray potential, and we're able to make that come to life, come true, thanks to the overworked bishop here. We play rook a1, no choice. The bishop captures our rook, dealing with the a-file drama, but opening up a new can of tactical worms across the h2 b8 diagonal. Now the bishop earlier was trying to do two things, right? Guard a1, block this diagonal. Now the rook is trying to do two things, guarding c7 and guarding b8. We're able to overwhelm the rook, queen b8, force the rook over to b8, and now the knight happily takes advantage of the space the rook left behind, delivering a beautiful mate from above. So once again, big shout out to Jolteon29A and Seth WMD, and thanks everybody for joining me for this wild puzzle.